The first time I met Audra Templeton, she was yelling at my rooster through the slats of my fence. "You better shut that thing up or I'll have the HOA fine you into next week," she shrieked, clutching her clipboard like it was a holy relic. I stood there, garden hose in hand, sweat dripping off my forehead from laying mulch all morning. "Good morning to you too, Audra," I said. "You know it's legal to have backyard chickens in this county, right?" Audra, the self-declared queen of the Maple Glen HOA, sniffed like I'd offended her ancestors. "Legal doesn't mean acceptable, Mr. Curtis Penley, and your rooster is disrupting the neighborhood peace." I've received several complaints. Funny. My nearest neighbors were a retired couple who brought me cookies last week and a young family whose daughter, Fiona, spent every other afternoon feeding my hens. "I'm not removing my birds," I said flatly and turned back to my garden. That was when the real games began. 3 days later, I got a warning letter on official HOA letterhead claiming I was in violation of noise ordinances. I checked the decibel readings with my own meter. My rooster, Buckbeak, crowed at dawn and never crossed the legal limit. Still, the letters kept coming. Then came the early morning inspections. Audra strutted onto my property with a tape measure and her phone camera, snapping photos of my coop, my fence, even the feed bins. I caught her once halfway through my backyard, muttering about property values. "Unless you're bringing coffee or a warrant, you're trespassing," I told her. She huffed, but waddled off in her orthopedic sandals. I started documenting everything: dates, photos, videos. Even installed a motion-activated camera facing the back gate. I wasn't just dealing with a narcissistic busybody. Audra was using her HOA position like a sledgehammer, and I had a feeling she wasn't following the rules herself. Things escalated when I got hit with a $300 fine. Reason? Uncontrolled livestock noise creating community distress. I appealed it. The HOA board denied my request without a hearing. That's when I started digging. Turns out, Audra had been fining residents for everything from mailbox paint to wine chimes. And when I cross-checked her fines against the HOA's own bylaws, half of them weren't even valid. But here's the kicker. The HOA president had mysteriously moved out 6 months ago, and no one had voted Audra into the position. She just started signing things. On paper, she wasn't even authorized to issue fines. I printed every document, every bylaw, every email she sent. I filed a formal complaint with the county and requested a hearing through small claims court. She laughed when she got the summons. "You really think a judge cares about your little chicken farm?" I looked her dead in the eye. "I think he'll care about someone impersonating an HOA officer while illegally collecting fines." That wiped the smile right off her face. The courtroom was colder than expected for a spring morning, and the judge had the tight-lipped expression of someone who'd seen one too many petty disputes. But I wasn't here over a barking dog or a lawn gnome. I was here because Audra Templeton had turned our neighborhood's HOA into her personal fiefdom, and I wasn't the only one with a bone to pick. She strutted into the chamber in a cream-colored pantsuit, flanked by 2 clipboard-carrying board members I'd never seen attend a single HOA meeting. One of them was her cousin Tricia, I think, who worked part-time at a tanning salon. The other was a man with a Bluetooth earpiece and the vacant stare of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. They didn't bother speaking to me as they passed, but Audra met my eyes. Hers were daring me no, daring the entire legal system to tell her she couldn't do whatever she wanted. That was her mistake. The judge, an older gentleman named Harold R. Dunn, glanced at the file in front of him. His brow furrowed as he flipped through the stack of papers I'd submitted a week prior. He looked at me first. "Mr. Penley, you are the complainant in this matter?" "Yes, Your Honor." He nodded once, then turned to Audra. "And you are Mrs. Templeton?" "Miss," she corrected with a tone sharp enough to slice drywall. "And I'm acting president of the Maple Glen Homeowners Association." Judge Dunn removed his glasses. "Acting or elected?" Audra blinked. Well, the previous president moved away unexpectedly and the board was there a vote, she hesitated. There was consensus. Consensus is not a vote, the judge said. He turned back to me. Proceed. I stood and handed the clerk a thin stack of documents. Your Honor, these are the governing bylaws of the Maple Glen HOA, which require a formal election to appoint or replace any board member. No such election has occurred for the presidency. I waited while he skimmed the relevant section. He gave a slight grunt and nodded. Additionally, I continued, the fines issued against me were not approved by the board as required. I have emails here showing they were sent directly from Miss Templeton without recorded votes, board meetings, or any community notification. Audra's mouth opened, but the judge raised his hand. Miss Templeton, you'll have your turn. He scanned the emails, then looked at the fine notices themselves. These are signed only by you. Where are the meeting minutes approving these actions? There weren't any minutes, she snapped, because there was no meeting. But I have the authority to enforce community standards. No, you have the obligation to follow the HOA's charter, Judge Dunn said, which you appear to have ignored. I kept going. Your Honor, I also have footage from my backyard security camera showing Miss Templeton entering my property without permission on 4 separate occasions. This time, even the judge's eyebrows lifted. Is this true, Miss Templeton? She adjusted her necklace. I was conducting visual inspections. The HOA has a right to ensure compliance with property guidelines. Visual inspections do not require entering fenced private property without consent, he said. Unless you have a warrant or an emergency, that's trespassing. She turned red. I added, and finally, Your Honor, I have bank statements and testimony from 6 other residents who have been fined for violations that don't exist in the bylaws, one of whom had their wages garnished after Miss Templeton filed a lien on their home without a vote. That did it. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the folder. Miss Templeton, this court finds substantial evidence that you acted outside the scope of your authority, issued unlawful fines, and trespassed on private property. Audra opened her mouth, but he kept going. In addition, your actions appear to constitute fraud under the state's homeowner association statutes, impersonating an officer, collecting unauthorized fees, and misappropriating funds. Her face went pale. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation. In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary injunction. You are to cease all HOA-related activity effective immediately and vacate your position until a formal election can be held. The courtroom was silent. Then he added, furthermore, I'm ordering you to reimburse all fines collected under your unlawful authority personally, not from HOA funds. If you fail to comply within 30 days, I will authorize wage garnishment and asset seizure. Audra's jaw actually dropped. Tricia looked like she was about to cry. Bluetooth earpiece guy slipped out the side door like he just remembered he left his car running. As we exited the courtroom, a local news crew was waiting outside. I hadn't called them, but someone had. Probably Linda from down the street. Her hydrangeas had been cited for being too aggressively blue. The reporter asked Audra for a comment, but she stormed past them, muttering something about witch hunts and ungrateful peasants. I let her go. Instead, I turned to the camera. We just want our neighborhood back. We're not against rules, we're against abuse. That evening, folks gathered in my backyard. A potluck formed spontaneously: ribs, cornbread, deviled eggs. I brought out extra chairs, and someone even set up a projector to replay the court footage from someone's phone. Every time the judge said unauthorized, the crowd cheered like it was a sports game. But something else happened that night. People started talking about forming a new board not just to replace Audra, but to rewrite the way the HOA functioned entirely. No more unchecked power. No more surprise fines. Everything open, transparent, voted on. I wasn't planning to run for anything. I liked my chickens, my garden, and my quiet. But as I looked around at the neighbors who'd been too scared to speak up until now, who were laughing, sharing stories, and finally breathing again, I realized I didn't have much of a choice. We weren't just taking back our HOA. We were building something better. And next time someone tried to seize control with a clipboard and a scowl, they'd find a community standing in their way. As for Audra, she sold her house 3 weeks later, quietly and far below market price. Rumor had it the DA's office was still investigating her financials. I didn't ask for details, I didn't have to. Buckbeak crowed the next morning at 6:15, right on schedule. No one complained. In fact, Fiona from next door left him a handful of corn on the fence post. The neighborhood was finally awake, and this time for the right reasons. The week after Audra vanished from Maple Glen was quieter than any in recent memory. Not in the sense of silence, Buckbeak still crowed and kids still rode their bikes up and down the cul-de-sac, but quiet in that heavy, anticipatory way. Like the whole neighborhood was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it did. On a humid Tuesday morning, I was replacing the cracked stepping stones in my garden path when a white Ford Explorer with County Auditor's Office decals pulled up in front of Audra's now empty house. 2 men in gray sport coats stepped out, followed by a woman in slacks carrying a file box. They didn't knock. They used a key from the lockbox and went straight inside. I leaned over the fence and nodded to Mrs. Greer, who was trimming her boxwoods 2 doors down. "You expecting guests?" She squinted at the SUV. "Not unless the counties started offering landscaping consultations." More cars arrived over the next hour. A black sedan with government plates, a white van with a satellite dish on top. By noon, uniformed officers from the county sheriff's office were photographing the inside of Audra's garage, where they'd hauled out 4 oversized filing cabinets. One of the cabinets was padlocked. They pried it open on the driveway. I counted at least a dozen thick envelopes, each labeled with names I recognized, residents who'd moved out over the past year. Some had left suddenly, others under the weight of liens and penalties. By evening, the word had spread. Audra hadn't just impersonated an HOA officer. She'd been embezzling funds, tens of thousands, from a separate beautification fund she claimed was approved by the board. There was no board approval. There was no beautification fund. The money had gone to a shell account registered in her cousin Tricia's name. She had used the funds for personal expenses, spa treatments, online shopping, and, according to one of the deputies, a down payment on a timeshare in Arizona. The very next day, a community meeting was held at the public library. For the first time in over a year, every seat was filled. Frank Doyle, a retired CPA who lived at the far end of the cul-de-sac, stood at the front with a projector and a stack of spreadsheets. "This is what she collected in unauthorized fines over the last 12 months, he said, pointing to column after column of neatly itemized charges. "And here's where it went." The room was dead silent as he moved to a slide showing a calendar with every check Audra had deposited. She staggered the withdrawals to avoid suspicion, never more than a few thousand at a time, but it adds up. $37,652. "Gone," a woman in the back gasped. Her husband clenched his jaw and folded his arms. Frank continued. "We've submitted everything to the district attorney's office. They're opening a formal case. Charges include wire fraud, misuse of HOA authority, and criminal impersonation." Someone asked, "What happens to the liens she filed?" A man in a blue polo answered from the front row. "Already in motion. I'm working with the county clerk to have them reversed." Every one of them was filed without proper documentation. That man turned out to be Evan Delgado, a real estate attorney who had moved in only 3 months ago. He'd kept a low profile until now, but apparently the fine Audra slapped on him for ornamental tree overgrowth had lit a fire. "She tried to force a sale on my house over that nonsense," he said. "I dug into the filing. It wasn't just improper, it was criminal. She forged signatures from a non-existent board vote." The room erupted into hushed outrage. Then someone said what we were all thinking. "How did she get away with it for so long?" Frank sighed. "Because no one checked. We trusted the system. She counted on that. I stood and cleared my throat. She also made sure people didn't feel safe pushing back. The moment someone challenged her, she buried them in paperwork and threats. Half the neighborhood thought she had legal authority she never actually had. Evan added, "That ends now. We're forming a temporary oversight committee, no more secret fines, no more backdoor decisions, everything documented, everything voted on." The applause started slow but built fast. By the time we left that night, a sign-up sheet for committee volunteers had 3 full pages of names. People were done being afraid, but the investigation didn't stop there. The next week, 2 detectives visited the neighborhood again. This time, they went door to door asking questions about a storage unit Audra had rented under her maiden name. Apparently, it was filled with HOA documents going back over 5 years, some dating to before she held any position at all. Inside, they found shredded mailing labels, counterfeit HOA stationery, and a half-completed form requesting a grant from the county for neighborhood security enhancements. The application had been drafted using a forged signature from the original HOA president, the one who'd moved away abruptly. When the detectives tracked him down, he told them he hadn't moved of his own accord. He'd left after Audra threatened to expose him for mismanaging funds he never had access to. She blackmailed him into resigning. That changed everything. With that revelation, the DA's office upgraded the charges. Audra was now facing extortion in addition to the financial crimes. Tricia was named as a co-conspirator, and the man with the Bluetooth earpiece. He turned out to be a notary who had been signing off on fake lien documents in exchange for cash under the table. The sheriff's office issued arrest warrants that Friday. Audra was picked up at a hotel 2 counties over, trying to withdraw the last of the Shell account's funds. The arrest made the evening news. Her mugshot was plastered across the screen during dinner. Fiona's mom turned it off halfway through, saying her daughter didn't need to see that kind of thing. The HOA's bank accounts were frozen. The county appointed a financial trustee to oversee the return of improperly collected fines. Within a month, most residents had received refund checks. The house Audra left behind sat vacant for a while. Eventually, it was repossessed and sold at auction. The family that moved in an ER nurse and her husband, a carpenter, were welcomed with open arms. We made sure they knew exactly what had gone down and what we were doing now to prevent anything like it from happening again. The new HOA committee held its first open election in June. Evan was voted in as president, Frank as treasurer. I declined a formal role, but agreed to serve as a community liaison, just a fancy title for the guy who kept an eye on things and spoke plain truth when no one else wanted to. We added new bylaws. No board action without a recorded vote, no fines without photographic evidence and written notice, and all financials published quarterly online for every resident to review. We also added a rule that no single person could hold more than 1 position of authority in the HOA. Ever again, the transformation was slow but steady. People started planting flowers again. Kids chalked the sidewalks without fear of citations. Neighbors talked, helped each other, shared tools and meals. One afternoon, Evan stopped by while I was replacing a gutter bracket. He nodded toward the coop. "You know, Buckbeak's got a fan club now. Fiona started a blog about him, says he's the reason we got our neighborhood back." I chuckled. Not bad for a rooster. Evan leaned against the fence. "You ever regret going after her like that?" I tightened a screw. "Every day I waited before doing it." He gave a low whistle. "Well, you started something, and we're gonna keep it going." As he walked off, I looked around. The hedges were trimmed, the lawns neat, but nothing felt sterile anymore. It felt lived in. It felt ours. Not because of some rulebook, but because we finally remembered we were neighbors before we were subjects to a board. And upstairs, Buckbeak let out a proud crow, as if to say, "Told you so." I was repairing the split-rail fence near the west end of my yard when the first sign of real fallout arrived: a letter, this time from the State Attorney General's office. The envelope was thick, the kind you get when someone means business. I opened it on the porch, boots still muddy and hands gritty from the afternoon's work. Inside were two documents, one informing me that I'd been listed as a material witness in an ongoing criminal inquiry, and another a formal request to appear before a grand jury in the county courthouse. The charges against Audra Templeton had grown far beyond impersonation or petty fines. The state had officially filed for prosecution on racketeering and conspiracy to defraud. Across the street, Mrs. Keener paused her evening walk to nod toward the mail in my hand. "Another one?" she asked. "This one's different," I said. "They're assembling a grand jury." She didn't say anything else, just nodded once and kept walking. Everyone in Maple Glen had grown used to bad news arriving in official envelopes. But this one was more than that. This was the beginning of the end. The courthouse was stifling the day I testified. Not from heat, just from the sheer tension. 8 people sat on the jury bench, most of them local. I saw a grocery store manager, a school bus driver, and a woman I recognized from the county library, all listening with furrowed brows and sharp eyes. The prosecutor, a tall woman named Miss Harrow, walked me through the evidence again. But this time, it wasn't about HOA violations or forged forms. This time, she was building a case for deliberate financial coercion, falsified legal threats, and most damning forced displacement. "Mr. Penley," she said, "can you describe what happened to the Grays at Lot 26? "They were gone in less than 48 hours, I said. "They got a letter saying their property was in violation of an ordinance about backyard irrigation runoff even though they didn't have sprinklers. The next morning, a moving truck showed up. They told me Audra promised to waive the fees if they left quietly. And did they? They left that night. They didn't even say goodbye, just vanished. The jury didn't need to murmur. Their silence said enough." Another witness followed, a former notary named Jerome Delancey. He was older, worn down, and his voice cracked as he admitted what he'd done. "She told me it was procedural," Jerome said. "Said the board had already voted, I just had to sign off. I didn't know she was filing liens against people with no legal basis." "And when did you realize?" "When the sheriff's office knocked on my door," he said, looking down. "I almost lost my license." I'll never notarize another document again. The final blow came from a forensic accountant the state had brought in. She presented a full breakdown of the fake Neighborhood Infrastructure Fund. Audra had invented over $50,000 funneled through a string of dummy accounts. More than 20 families had paid into it, believing it was for sidewalk repair and new signage. There were no bids, no permits filed, and no record of any municipal contact, the accountant explained. Every dollar went into private use. By the time the grand jury returned a true bill for prosecution, Audra was already in custody at the county detention facility. The judge had denied bail, citing risk of flight and potential witness tampering, but the state wasn't finished. A few days after the indictment, the Attorney General's office filed a civil petition requesting Audra's permanent removal from Maple Glen under the state's nuisance and fraud statutes. It was rare, almost unheard of, but the law allowed for it. If a person had used fraudulent authority to seize control of a neighborhood mechanism and done irreparable harm in the process, the court could order their eviction. The hearing was set for the following Monday. I wasn't required to attend, but I did anyway. The courtroom was packed. Not with strangers this time, nearly every seat was filled with Maple Glen residents. Most had never sat in a courtroom before, but they all sat silently, waiting. Audra entered in a beige jumpsuit, wrists cuffed, face pale. Her attorney, a man with a thinning hairline and a nervous tick in his jaw, stayed close to her side. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Justice Merriweather, took her seat and addressed the court with no ceremony. "This is a petition for injunctive relief and permanent relocation under State Code 48C, she said. "Let's proceed." The state prosecutor didn't waste time. She laid out the pattern of harassment, the manipulation of legal instruments, and the irreparable damage to community function. She cited psychological evaluations from residents who had suffered panic attacks, declining health, even job loss after dealing with Audra's threats and forged documents. Then she presented the final piece, a sworn affidavit from the HOA's original founding attorney confirming that Audra's name had never been on the official board registry ever. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "not only did Miss Templeton fabricate her authority, she rewrote the rules to suit her needs, then punished anyone who resisted. She used the image of a homeowners association to commit large-scale fraud. She made herself judge, jury, and collector. And she did it all from a position she never held." Audra's attorney stood and tried to argue that relocation was excessive, that she had no prior criminal record, that she'd simply misunderstood the scope of her duties. Justice Merriweather didn't even blink. Misunderstanding one's duties does not explain forged signatures, falsified financial accounts, or threatening residents with eviction over non-existent violations. She turned to Audra directly. "You have weaponized a system meant to protect community standards and turned it into a tool for personal gain. Your presence in this neighborhood is untenable." Then she issued the order. "Miss Templeton is hereby barred from residing within 50 miles of Maple Glen or any affiliated HOA for a period of no less than 15 years. She is to vacate all property and cease contact with any current or former residents. Any violation of this order will be treated as a felony." Audra didn't speak. She just sat there, staring at the floor as the deputy led her out through the side door. The courtroom didn't cheer. There was no applause, just a long, collective exhale. That night, we met again, this time not in outrage, but in quiet solidarity. The new board had arranged for a community dinner at the park. Folding tables stretched end to end, covered in homemade casseroles, paper plates, and pitchers of lemonade. Evan stood at the head of the table and raised a glass. "To everyone who didn't give up," he said. "To every voice that refused to be silenced, and to the neighbors who made this place home again." We raised our glasses not in triumph but in unity. I found myself next to Jerome, the former notary. He looked tired but less burdened. "I should have asked questions," he said, staring into his cup. "I just thought she knew what she was doing." "She did," I said, "and that was the problem," he nodded slowly. "I'm glad you fought back." I didn't have the guts. I looked around at the crowd, kids playing tag near the swings, couples chatting over potato salad, the elderly woman from Lot 11 handing out homemade cookies. "I didn't really have a choice," I said. This place deserved better. Later that night, I walked home under a sky dotted with stars. Buckbeak was already roosting in his coop, the hens nestled in beside him. I latched the gate, checked the feed, and stood there a moment in the quiet. No threats, no letters. No clipboard peeking over the fence, just peace. And for the first time in a long while, it felt permanent.